Trust for 20 years. I started out of actually my second year of college as a field engineer, when the trust actually got some money to go out and do some stuff, do some work. I did that October 2014. I was appointed executive director of the organization, and really since that time I've taken it on as a personal sort of challenge to not only do the job of executive director, but come to these groups and update everybody, let everybody know who we are, what we do, and why it's important. And I'm always available. I'll have my business cards here at the end. Anybody needs to reach me, any questions at all. Any question about groundwater wood piles when I get to the end of this. If anybody has any questions, friends, colleagues, always send them to me. I tell that to everybody. I tell that to Councilor Edwards every time I see her. Councilor Edwards actually lives in East Boston. Her house is on wood piles. So she called me a couple of times. She's like, what's a wood pile? What's this? So I gave her a crash course in this too. But I am going to go through this, and it's not just me getting up here speaking. If you have a question about anything, just let me know if anything's unclear, okay? So this is the homepage of our website, bostongroundwater.org, and we recently released a series of informational videos about who we are, what we do, the groundwater issue in Boston, and ultimately the worst case scenario. What happens if in fact the piles that support the building are rotted and the building needs to be repaired, what the homeowner, what the building owner needs to do. Anything that's ever been written about the groundwater issue, all our projects, all of our well readings and data, it's all up on the website. All of our meetings are open to the public, so if anybody was ever interested, we meet every other month at the Lennox Hotel. You can come in there and just sit in a meeting. We post all our meetings on the homepage. Agendas are posted a week before the meeting, so all that information is up there. So what do? Well, we were established by the Boston City Council in 1986. And our main purpose is to monitor groundwater levels in the city where there are wood piling supported buildings, and make sure that the groundwater levels remain underground, remain above the tops of those pilings. If the ground levels drop, the pilings become exposed to air, and it's a race against time to find out why they drop, bring the ground levels back up. If they're down for an extended period of time, for years, they rot. I'll show you some pictures. The building starts to settle and eventually fail. We have a network of 800 observation wells throughout the city where we monitor the groundwater levels, and I'll show you a map exactly where all those are. We also work through the BPDA review process, so any Article 8 project, we have the opportunity to comment. When there's a scoping session, we sit on the city side of the table with the other agencies, provide comments to make sure that any new development is not going to negatively impact groundwater levels, and I'll review that quickly as well. We also promote methods of recharging to raise and maintain groundwater levels, and I'll review that as well. Porous sidewalks, recharge systems, taking the roof leaders in the buildings, instead of having them spill out onto the sidewalk, put them back into the ground via a recharge system. That helps raise and maintain the groundwater. So why we're established, these were the articles in the 1980s in the Boston Herald, and maybe it was a Record American back then, the Boston Globe. Problem started in flat at Beacon Hill. There was an issue. There was a faulty sewer. Problem was there was no groundwater trust monitoring groundwater levels. So all of a sudden, all these buildings started sinking and cracking, and nobody had any idea why. They hired some engineers, and we found out that the piles had rotted, the groundwater levels had dropped. It took them a little while to figure out why the groundwater levels had dropped. And but when they did that, there was this gigantic lawsuit. People in Lower Beacon Hill went to the city and said, what are you doing just for our buildings? Is there any program in place? The city said, no, we're not doing anything. They established the trust. So Boston's very unique in that a large majority of it, a huge chunk of it, about 5,000 acres of it, is filled land. So this is what, the view from the State House in 1858, this is what Back Bay looked like, okay? It was just a bay. You had Arlington Street, Beacon Street. As you head towards over there, if you head towards west, Fenway Park at some point would have been there. But this is the south end, the Back Bay. Here is the north end. Majority of East Boston's all filled. I get a lot, oh, that's a Back Bay thing, that's a Beacon Hill thing. It's not. It's in many other areas, as I'll show you in here. So what did? They filled it in. Okay, so it took a very long time. They filled in different areas. The Back Bay and the Fenway alone took 30 years just to fill in. And this building right here is actually the current building that's still there today. It's the Restoration Hardware in the Back Bay. This sort of just gives you an idea of what the scope was like in the scale. You start to see the formation of early row houses along Beacon Street and the start of the Commonwealth Avenue Mall. Most of the fill they brought in from Needham by train. All they did was just dump it in. Okay, it was called unconsolidated fill, which means that it was just placed there. It's like taking a shovel of dirt and just tossing it. That's what they did. So today, this is what Boston looks like. But the area in red is what we call original land. So all the area that's in black and white is filled land. In any of those areas that have brick buildings on them and were built, constructed between mid-1800s to the early 1900s, most likely they're on piles because those are heavy buildings. And that's why they had to use piles because, again, the fill was unconsolidated. It wasn't like you just put it on solid ground. So this is what the north end looked like in 1826. And here you can see ultimately where Commercial Street would be, Fulton Street, Hanover Street. Those streets exist, but Commercial Street was basically in the water. Okay? So any of these buildings around the fringe, and then on the other side, over by the Bull Fringe Triangle, once that land was filled in and they put up the brick buildings, they were supported on pilings. Again, why wood pile? Land was made to use unconsolidated fill, couldn't support heavy structures, and it was really the best available technology until the mid-1920s when they started using concrete and steel.
Can you explain what unconsolidated fill is, or what
Sure.
consolidated fill is?
Unconsolidated fill is basically, like I said, just taking a pile of dirt and just
Right.
dumping it somewhere. Consolidated fill is actually engineered and pressed and compressed to allow for structure to be placed on it. Here, they just filled in the bed.
What
It's
would
almost like
compress it
filling in a big pool.
Well, what would they compress it with?
They would compress it with all different types of, today they would compress it with machines. They'd have these huge drivers just go right over. You know how like when they do a parking lot, you see a huge scraper come over?
Yeah, it's kind of like pressure pack.
To level,
Pressure
yeah.
pack dirt, got it.
Yeah, basically, yeah. So, how long can wood piles last? Indefinitely, okay? There are buildings, cathedrals in Europe, that's where this technology came from, that can last 500-600 years, you know, even more. It takes a while for the wood to rot as well. Okay, so we got two things on our side here, okay? A lot of these structures, number one, were overbuilt, which means they didn't have computers back then to estimate that they needed an exact number of piles under a certain building. Pretty much every building that's supported on piles has almost double the amount of piles that it needs. Okay, that's a good thing. The second thing is the process of rotting is very, very slow. It takes years for a pile to be exposed, air to get at it, microbes essentially just to start to eat away at the wood, and then for buildings to start to show signs of distress. That problem in Beacon Hill, it was estimated that it probably took a good 6 to 7 years of depressed groundwater levels, permanently depressed groundwater levels, to be exposed to air for the buildings to start to show settlement. Other good thing is it's a race against time I mentioned to find out why the groundwater levels are low. When we have a problem and we see that the groundwater levels are low, it's usually a leak, and it's usually got something to do with us. Something to do with a pipe, something to do with a basement, something to do with somebody not doing something they're not supposed to. If we fix that and you raise the groundwater levels, the process of rotting slows to a crawl. Because now what you did was you remove the oxygen, okay, that allows those microbes to feed. They basically just drown and die, and the process of rotting again slows to a crawl. So that's why we raise the groundwater levels. These are ideal conditions. This is what we strive for in every neighborhood. Groundwater level is indicated by this upside down triangle into the ground, okay? It's above the tops of the pilings. These granite blocks actually are what support the structure that's set on top of the pilings, so that's where we want the groundwater level. Above the tops of the pilings fully saturated. In order to find out if a building is at risk, you gotta dig a hole. It's called a test pit. You go right down next to the foundation of a building, probably about a 10-foot wide hole or so. You go down another 15 feet and you expose the wood piles. This is what you hope to find. A nice wood pile, 10 to 12 inches in diameter, in good shape, in full contact with that granite pile cap. Piles are in good shape, no signs of settlement, everything's good. Same thing here, this is actually under the old South Church. These are wood piles under the old South Church. They're in excellent shape. The groundwater table was lowered temporarily to take this picture as it was in the other picture, but again, piles are in good shape. That's what we're looking for. What we're not looking for, depressed groundwater levels, okay? Groundwater table drops for whatever reason. Like I said, leaky pipe, you know, an extended period of drought. When piles become exposed to air, they stop rotting, the building starts to settle, okay? Potential cost to fix a building, to underpin a building, is anywhere from $250,000 or more. There's a building here in the north end, I'm not gonna name it, we spent over $3 million to repair that building, okay? Wouldn't wanna live in that building. It was a huge special assessment, but again, this was before we really started to get up and running with our monitoring program and really weren't aware of the issue until they were basically in full mode to repair it. These are what rotted wood piles look like, okay? This is from a building in Beacon Hill in the 80s where the groundwater table had dropped for an extended period of time. And it's almost like just taking an unsharpened pencil and putting it into a pencil sharpener. Over time, that top rots. And once that goes, that granite block that sits on top sinks. When that happens, the building above it starts to settle. They also rot at different rates. Not every pile rots evenly. If they did, the whole building would settle even, but it doesn't. You have a constant push-pull, it's called differential settlement, where the building is stressing and straining on the way down. These are what rotted wood piles look like throughout the city. Different buildings over the years that we've compiled that have had to be underpinned. Okay? These were houses in East Boston that no longer exist, that were torn down because of rotted piles and because it was just too expensive to fix them at the time. The fix was worth more than the building was. Not the case today, but back then it was. This picture is not crooked, the houses. Okay? You can definitely see the slant. And the classic signs of distress are the cracks above the windows, below the windows, and the doorways. This is another sign of building distress where the bricks are actually starting to pull out away from the building. It's a result of the building, again, settling differentially, coming all the way down. What's the fix? It's called cut and cap. This is the underpinning fix. You have to dig down manually by hand, expose each one of these piles. You have to cut the piles off, typically 2 to 3 feet below where the existing groundwater level is. The engineer makes that determination. And you go through and you do it for each one. You reestablish the connection of the rotted pile between the good part of the pile and the granite pile cap. That whole thing gets encased in concrete, but you do that for a certain section. So if a building has 200 to 300 piles underneath it, and you can do maybe 6 to 8 piles a week, it's a months-long process. That's where the expense comes in. The time, the manpower to do it. You can't get down there with a machine. You have to do everything by hand. And ultimately, that's what we're trying to avoid. This is our monitoring area, so I mentioned all the filled land areas of the city, okay? So you have the north end, central waterfront, Chinatown, Fort Point, South End, Fenway, Back Bay. And again, the majority of East Boston, really because of the airport, is filled, but we do have an area here in the flats here in East Boston where there's a bunch of wood piling support structures right off of Maverick Square, essentially. How do we monitor groundwater levels? I mentioned the observation well. So there's 800 of these in the sidewalk. We have about 31 in the north end alone. Spread throughout the area, the affected area. We go through, we read all 800 wells about every 5 to 6 weeks. The engineers will go out, they'll read a certain area in a day, send the data in, we'll take a look at it. At the end, we generate a newsletter, which I'll be happy to include anybody on it. I actually just sent one out Tuesday morning. That was yesterday, I don't know where this week's going. That report usually gets generated every 5 to 6 weeks. Tell everybody what we're up to, what the groundwater levels are up to, where the hot spots are, all based on the groundwater level data. An observation well, it's just a PVC pipe in the ground that's perforated. Okay, goes about 20 feet, 25 feet into the ground. This allows for the groundwater to percolate into the well. Once we have the well in place, we secure it with a roadway box. We come up, we take a groundwater level measurement with a device that tells us the groundwater is 10 feet below the ground surface, 12 feet below the ground surface, and whether or not any buildings are at risk. So we use our groundwater level data combined with the data that we have for the building hot elevations of the wood piles underneath the building and determine whether or not an area is at risk, whether or not buildings are at risk. So these are all our wells. So on our website, our monitoring well data tab, each one of these little blue dots is an observation well. So I mentioned there's about 800 of them. And again, spread throughout all the affected areas of the city. When you go on the website, all of the wells are in what we call Boston City-based datum. The reason they're in that datum, the water level data is in that datum, is because the wood pile cutoff elevation is in that datum. Okay, so Boston City-based datum is basically mean low water level, okay, mean low tide. So when we talk about the wood pile cutoff elevations versus the groundwater elevations, we always want the groundwater elevations to be higher. So when you go on the website, you'll see a well, and you'll have a history of the readings. This is actually a well in the north end, okay, right in front of 100 Fulton Street. This number is elevation 9, consistently in elevation 7, 8, 9 category. Most of the piles were cut off at elevation 5. So what does that mean? If the piles are at 5, and the groundwater level is at 9, you have 4 feet of water above the tops of the pilings. We're good. If the groundwater level is at 4, and the pilings are at elevation 5, that means we're not good. Because now we have a foot of piling that's exposed to air. We have to figure out why. We have to look at the infrastructure, the utilities in the area, I'll talk about how we work with the local entities who have that infrastructure and how we partner with them. Everybody asks, why do you have 800 wells? Why do you have so many wells? All of these buildings were constructed at different times, okay? As a result of that, we have different buildings with different piling cutoff heights, okay? So what's good in one area for groundwater levels may not be good in another area. So what I mean by that is East Boston has an extraordinary number of high well elevations. Most of the wells are in the 7 to 8 category, solid wood piles, okay? Whereas you get in the north end, south end, Fenway, Back Bay, most of those piles were cut off at elevation 5. The buildings were constructed later, and at the time, we didn't have these buildings with deep basements. We didn't have all these sewers. We didn't have all these tunnels, okay? When we put all that stuff in, all of that created different spots and paths for groundwater to get into if it broke. So that's what would draw the groundwater into it. When they put these buildings up, the groundwater table is probably well above the tops of the pilings, but you're talking about buildings that are in some cases 200 years old, most around 130, 150 years old in that range. So we have to manage the groundwater levels for different sections of the city, and the groundwater levels and the building elevations, all those conditions can change from block to block. Because there's so much underground too. I mean, you have so many utilities, you have so many tunnels. In order for us to get a clear picture of where the problem is and where the groundwater levels are, we need that many wells. We've researched every building that's in the fieldland area of the city over the past 12 years. We've gone to inspectional services, we've gone on their website, we've gone to the library. Any building that had an original building permit, any building that had the information that we were looking for, we put up on our website. And it's broken down by neighborhood, okay? North End's up there as well, Back Bay, South End, they're all up there. Whatever we can find is up. The reason that's important is because we need to know where these buildings, the pile cutoffs are in relation to our groundwater levels and whether or not we need to look at the area. I mentioned the variability of the pile cutoff elevations. This was the building code in the 1900s, and you'll notice there's a huge variability here, okay? Where the wood piles shall be driven 24 inches on center, and the top should be cut at an elevation not higher than grade 5, that's BCB, except that the commissioner may in his discretion permit a higher point but not exceeding that. That's a 4-foot variable. Okay, that's what we're dealing with. So, I mentioned the buildings cut off at 8 and 9. The commissioner looked at the groundwater table and it was at 9. All right, fine, cut the piles off at 8. You know, you don't need to cut them off lower, they're fine, the water level's fine. Fast forward all these years later, not fine. And this was really the holy grail, what we were hoping to find, but a lot of these buildings are old, and in particular the north end, there's not a lot of information at all because the buildings are so old. But this would give us the original building permit, and we would be able to find how many piles were under the building, how many rows, and what the piles were cut off at. And for the most part, most of these are pretty accurate. We confirm them with various test pit reports that building owners have done and repairs over the years. These are pretty accurate. We feel pretty good about those numbers. When you dig a test pit, you get an engineer's report. The engineer will detail where the tops of the piles are. In this case, they were about elevation 7. And here they indicated where the groundwater table was, and that was about elevation 8.9. So that means we had almost 2 feet of water above the tops of the pilings. Well, the pilings under this building were fine. They were in excellent shape. This is the pile cutoff data that we have for the north end. So now we're on the other side going over towards the garden. And you can see a number of buildings here that have high pile cutoff elevations along Thatcher, okay, along North Washington, Stillman Street here, Endicott as well. Piles were cut off pretty high. Good news is we have wells over there. The water elevations are also very high, so that's really good. Unfortunately, when they were doing the artery, there were some buildings over here that didn't have compromise to that. They didn't have proper mitigation plan in place when they were doing the tunnel work. So some buildings over there did see pile settlement, building settlement, and ultimately they were repaired. They had to be repaired to do that work. We're in place now, so something like that wouldn't happen. Pile cutoff data here again is very scarce for the Commercial Street, Fulton Street. Any of the addresses that are blank we searched, we couldn't find any information. Any of the buildings here that are in red are buildings that we found information for that the piles were indeed repaired. So at one point in time, before we started doing all our work, somebody went in there, fixed the piles because of depressed groundwater levels. Again, all of that's on our website. So I mentioned monitoring levels, how do we fix the leaks, how do we address the issues. You look at the sewers, you look at the tunnels, if any of that is breached, if any of that is not working the way it should, if it's not sealed properly, they fix it. Also, any new project, anything that comes in, Article 80, anybody that comes in says, I want to put in this big building here with 2 to 3 levels of underground parking, they need to certify to us as part of the approval process that the building will be watertight. Okay, any elevated pit that gets put in will have no sump pumps, that'll be completely waterproof. Same thing with underground garage, it'll be completely waterproof. It will not allow for the intrusion of groundwater, okay? It'll be its own separate, essentially, bathtub, it'll be dry. No sump pumps, no under drains, okay? A lot of the buildings that will be constructed in any other part of the country, that will be the way to get the groundwater level, keep the groundwater out of the building. Here, that doesn't fly. We promote green infrastructure, as I mentioned. We advise residents on installing recharge systems, promote pervious pavers and pavement. We're more than happy to talk about that. That's a whole other presentation in itself. The G-Cod, this is Article 32 zoning that was implemented in 2005. So basically, anybody that comes in and hits any of these triggers, if they substantially rehabilitate a building, is defined by 50% of the assessed value of the building. If they dig down below elevation 7, if they build out a big structure, anything greater than 50 square feet, if they pave or resurface an area, they're required to put in a recharge system, which means that when you go to ISD for your building permit and you hit any one of these triggers, you get your turn down letter. Cited for Article 32, the applicant has to go to water and sewer, get a system that's approved for recharge, again, just taking the roof leaders and putting it back into the ground instead of out into the street or into their system. And then for the bigger buildings, they have to certify to us via the no harm letter, okay? Which is a stamped letter from an engineer stating this construction will not negatively impact groundwater levels because of A, B, C, and D. This is the area of the G-Cod. So the Groundwater Conservation Overlay District spans all these field land areas here, and the salmon. This area of the north end of the Bullfinch, when this was drafted in 2005, is called the no harm area. So in your area, they're not required per the zoning to install recharge systems, but rather just to certify to us that any new construction is not going to negatively impact the no harm part, okay? However, in 2011, Boston Water and Sewer, as part of a consent decree with the EPA, requires everybody citywide that goes to them for a water connection to put in recharge. So everybody's putting in recharge, even if they're not in the G-Cod in your area. So you are getting water in. Part of my proposal to the BPDA and Commissioner Christopher's office at ISD is to modify the zoning to have you get recharge per the zoning, to expand some of the areas and shrink some of the areas. The zoning was written, again, 12 years ago. We've learned a lot since then about groundwater levels and pile cutoffs. And at the time when this was written, we didn't have any information at the Bullfinch and North End yet on water levels of wood piles. So at the time, they just said, okay, just make that the no harm area, that way you can always come back and change it. It's certainly time to change it. I mentioned all it is just taking the roof leaders, putting them back into the ground, helping maintain and raise the groundwater table, and get rid of the ice rinks here in January and February, which is also nice. So all of these, it's hard to see because they're pretty dense. Blue stars are 563 recharge systems that have been installed through the zoning so far. Okay, there are dozens more in the pipeline. As I did mention, cities required. Water and Sewer's making everybody do it. You'll start to see a bunch, obviously, with all the buildings over here in the Bullfinch, but anybody that substantially rehabilitated their buildings over here had to put in recharge systems because they went to Water and Sewer. So I mentioned fixing infrastructure. You got all this stuff underground, okay? Sewer pipes, manholes, drain lines. It's like owning a home. Something's going to break eventually, okay? And when it does, usually you get a breach and the groundwater levels drop. So we had an issue with the corner of Fairfield and Beacon Street. In the summer of 2016, we had the driest summer we ever had. We had just under 4 inches of rain over 4 months. Got a lot of rain that fall. Groundwater levels came up except for a corner. And we said, all right, this is odd. Why is everything else coming up and this isn't? So we put an automated logger, which is just basically suspended in a well, and it takes a reading every hour, okay? It's just an instrument that just sits in the well and provides us a reading. And what it showed to us is that when we had a significant amount of rain, the groundwater level spiked immediately and then dropped right back down. Telltale sign, that there's a pipe leaking somewhere, that there's a problem. So we worked with water and sewer and said, hey, what do you have for sewers over there? And they said, we got some pretty big sewers, we'll go take a look. The elevation of the water here was roughly at elevation 3, okay? Water and sewer went out, looked at their pipe and said, oh, we got a huge leak. I said, where is it? It's at elevation 3. They fixed the pipe, and what happened? In less than 24 hours, the water levels came up 2 feet. Groundwater levels move in inches, not feet. This just highlights how important it is to monitor the groundwater levels and how important it is to identify the leaks and make the fix. Because once you make the fix, for the next period of several weeks, the groundwater levels came up, they stayed up. The water levels in this area now, at about a dozen wells, the highest they've ever been in over 15 years. I mentioned the pile cutoffs before, so this is what it was like before. This is where the groundwater was, exposing the piles. Here at elevation 3, when they made the fix, came up. Now the water level is well above the tops of the pilings. Buildings haven't shown any signs of distress in that area. We're in good shape. Porous pavers, I mentioned, this is another way to get water into the ground instead of recharge systems. This is along Boylston Street, across the street from the public library. You're going to start to see more of these. We work on Public Works to implement these throughout the city, not just there, but actually the bike lane over on Commercial Street is actually porous pavement. We're going to start to see more of that too. We're going to be able to capture that water that's coming off the sidewalk, and instead of going into the sewers and the drains, go into the ground. East Boston Central Square, that whole area that was redone is all porous materials, okay? Pervious concrete, pervious pavement, pervious pavers, all different types. So there's a ton of different ways you can do this. There's a ton of different ways you can make it look good. There's a ton of different ways you can make it look ugly too. But usually it looks pretty good, but you have to maintain it, okay? The cost to install it versus conventional asphalt is double, okay? That's why it's been slow to be implemented. But with the work that we do, not only with ISD, but also through the city's Environment, Energy, and Open Space, Chief Cook is on our board, he's a trustee, we're funded by them. By the way, that's where we get our money. We're contracted by them to do the work. We've worked with them to implement more of these throughout the city. You'll start to see more of these. It's not only good for us to get groundwater, it's good for them. It reduces pollution. It reduces the heat island effect. It's a win-win for everybody. Over time, people will become much more receptive to it, and we'll start to see more of these. Public awareness. So we actually have groundwater observation well covers that the public can interact with. Okay, it's called Project Lightwell, where you can download an app on your phone. This is for like the real techie, geeky. I mean, this is even for me, it's a lot, to get groundwater levels. But people do interact with it. We did have actually pretty good participation this summer when we did install them. And next summer, we're going to install them in the south end, and then they're going to make their way over here to the north end as well. I'll be working with Maria to get out a press release on that when we do come over here, so people know that they're there. They're different than the conventional cast iron. They're illuminated. You'll be able to use your phone and see where the groundwater level data is. It's just a way, again, to get people engaged and interact and aware of the issue. All right, what's at risk? Bottom line, this is a dollars issue, okay? Since 2012, property values have jumped 97%. Okay, you see the values of these buildings. This is just a block of the assessed values of the buildings in an affected area, okay? If you had all these buildings that are worth all this money that had rotted piles because we weren't monitoring groundwater levels and we didn't exist, and that problem with Beacon and Fairfield was just allowed to fester over time, you'd be putting all those buildings at risk, and you'd be talking about anywhere from $12 to $20 million to fix all the buildings. That's that one square block. Now multiply that by all the blocks in the city. That's what we're dealing with. That's why this is important to the city. That's why this is important to the residents. That's why it's important to us to prevent this. The problem with Beacon Hill occurred because there wasn't us. We weren't there. There was nobody looking. We're looking. The progress has been made. So we're funded annually by the city. I mentioned the city's Environment, Energy, and Open Space. We're contracted by them to do the work. We've built out the well network. We go in every year and we replace wells that are old, wells that have been destroyed, about 10 to 12 wells a year. But we don't do, when I first started, we had about 150 wells. We ended up getting money to install the network of wells, and from 2003 to 2008, pretty much supervising installation of all the wells. So that's been completed, that's been built out. The City State Groundwater Working Group, that's where we get together with BWSC, okay, with MBTA, MWRA, all the people, all the entities that own all the stuff underground. We get up and we say, these are where the groundwater levels are, these are where they're low, what do you have for infrastructure that potentially could be compromised? They'll go, they'll take a look. If it's broke, they fix it just like water is. The G-code I mentioned, okay, again, just preserves, helps bring up groundwater levels, also ensure no negative impact. In collaboration, again, I mentioned with Public Works, AWS, CISD, and the Climate Action Team. Okay, what are the next steps? Continue monitoring. As long as the buildings are on piles, you gotta monitor groundwater levels, that's it. Like owning a home, I mentioned, there's always something to fix, something's always gonna break, pipe's always gonna break, there's always gonna be something to look out for. New construction has no negative impact, as I mentioned, the no harm part. Modify the G-Con zoning, as I also mentioned, it's dated, adopted in 2006. We've learned much since then. Revise the locations, revise the thresholds. Continue to promote recharge, and also work with ISD on obtaining building information. So I mentioned those building permits that we found in the historical records. We're able to actually, working with the commissioner on this, they're going to be revising the building permit process. When they do that, there's going to be a brand new building permit application. On that, there's going to be a spot for us. If somebody's applying to do a test pit, or if somebody's applying to repair an independent building, we'll now get that information, which is essential for us to adding to our database, and again, just really finding out where the pile cutoffs are, and ultimately where we need to be looking. There may be an area, I don't think there is, but there may be an area that we're not thinking about that we should be thinking about or looking at. But you never know, and that'll really go a long way in helping us identify what areas are at risk. Again, I mentioned the informational videos on the website. I really just flew through this. The 3 videos, they're in total, they're about 11 minutes long. If you watch the first one, the second one, and the third one, obviously, to show the repair of the buildings, it'll go a long way into explaining a lot of this, and you'll probably even come up with some more questions, after viewing that. I hope you don't, but if you do, let me know. I'll certainly be happy to answer any of those. Any questions at all? Thank you for having me. I know I feel like I just breezed through that.
Yeah,
everybody was so quiet. Just figured I'd keep going.
Fascinating. Learned quite a bit. I'm just curious, how tall are the pilings, and how deep into the ground are they typically?
Typically, a pile could be 25 to 35 feet in length, and they'll be driven to what we call the soil bearing stratum. So it'll go through that unconsolidated fill that was dumped, and it'll go down essentially to the clay layer. So they're friction piles. So as soon as they were driven and they hit the surface where they met resistance, they stopped driving the pile. So it's based on really what the elevation of the fill is.
Right.
Most of the piles I've seen, again, are in that length. East Boston, there wasn't that much fill, so those piles are shorter. They're maybe 10 to 15 feet, so they're not that long. But typically, 20 feet or more is usually what it is. And all a pile is just a tree trunk with the branches cut off, driven upside down into the ground. That's what it is. So they're tapered. So they're about 10 to 12 inches at the top, and they taper to like 6 or 7 inches at the bottom.
And so are they typically, I don't know, just spitballing here, 10 feet of water and 10 feet of dirt, roughly, or 12 and 13, or what's an average?
It depends on where you are. If standing at the ground surface, typically we like to see groundwater about 10 feet below the groundwater surface, because that's usually where the pile is. So you could have, a piling that has 5 feet of water above it, 10 feet of water above it. It really depends on where you are in the city and how high and how low you are.
Any particular kind of wood?
Mostly spruce, some pine, but there was a book that I read that pretty much a whole forest in Maine gave its life to build the city. That's where they got all the piles.
And speaking of which, this is a huge number, but how many, do you have any, you must have an idea, or maybe you don't, how many pilings are there in the city, roughly?
I don't know how many pilings, but I can tell you that there are over 6,000 buildings that are supported on pilings. So if you take 200 and multiply that, you really can't do that because a lot of the buildings, some buildings are narrower, some buildings are wider, so the narrower, less piles, the wider the building, the more piles. Trinity Church has over 5,000 piles underneath it, just to give you an idea of what a mega structure, would be. A typical row house, like I said, has a couple of hundred. So, yeah, it's a lot.
Anyone in the audience have any questions? curious, wait, you said that most of them were built with more piles than they needed.
Yes.
So if you had 200 piles under a building and it was compromised, but you really only needed 100 to support the structure, do you have to fix all 200? Or can you strategically determine the ones that, the 100 that you would need to support the building?
It's a good question, very good question. The engineer will make that determination based on what they find when they dig. There have been buildings that have only had to have half their piles fixed for that very reason. Other buildings, you have to have all of them fixed, for whatever, it could be, you're sharing a party wall with somebody and there may be a barrier where the groundwater level for some reason is higher on this side of the building than it is on this side of the building. So yeah, ultimately it's once they open up and they take a look and they see what they're dealing with, that's when the decision is made. Yeah. But some people have spent 40,000, some people have spent 3 million. It depends. Yeah.
Do you do any, I know you mentioned the forest papers, I always wonder why it took so long to, obviously the cost, but I mean, they've
That's
been
the
around for
big
a while.
thing, yeah.
Do you do any work with like green roofs now? That's like a new thing too, or?
Yeah.
So you're yeah.
Yeah. Water and sewer does more with green roofs. They usually will work with developers on green roofs in the part of the city that's original land. Just because you're on original land, you really can't put in a groundwater recharge system because it's gonna flood. So that's more so for buildings that are in, again, the original land areas. However, people have gotten real creative with this stuff, and green roofs is one. And you start to see people get more creative with this stuff, especially in an urban environment where everything's on top of each other. Everybody's, so close. There's a ton of different ways you can do it. Sure.
All right, well, appreciate you coming and
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.